I think Paul can, yes, Paul can hear me. All
We
right.
can.
Well, today we're going to talk about ghostly tales of West Florida. In every October, as the leaves turn to their autumn colors and cool and colder wind begin to howl through the trees, the day grows shorter and the dark tentacles of night seem to spread faster and quicker. Our calendar turns to Halloween. We dress up a new trick or treat and we play prank, but underneath it all is the unsettling feeling that perhaps we're not alone in the physical world. And so we talk of ghosts and haunting and things that go bump in the night. Our ghost story grows from unexplained occurrences, sometimes growing from a single tale to a harvest of fright. In my role as an archivist, I try to preserve history. And in the practice of history, we attempt to apply reason, verify sources, look for evidentiary proof of why and how things happen. But well, with ghost stories, you can forget all that. So today from the archive, we're going to share some of the ghostly stories and tales of West Florida, and from tell you some of the things from the things that we have in our collections here. Ghosts are rife with imagination like legends, and sometimes our imagination gets the best of us. And the first story I want to share with you today, I call The Beating Door, or the Greek Witch of Pensacola. I got a phone call some years ago from an administrator at a local senior living center near the university, and she informed me that the Greek Witch of Pensacola had passed away at her facility, and that she had the witch's books and papers and other material in her closet. And she asked me to come and get them because people were refusing to come into her office. They were canceling their appointments. They were scared to come in the same room because these things were in the closet. And as she got talked further and further and got more agitated, my mind just went imagination. I thought about a closet door beating and pulsing like a Stephen King novel and all that. And so, of course, I rushed over there and got the material. Sadly, the closet was not beating. There were no weird books, and actually only about 7 books, one of which was a Gideon Bible with the name of the hotel in it. Now, in the publishing world, these books are fairly common, but one of the more interesting books was called Candle Magic. And this is a book involved setting up a little altar at home, a little incense, perfume, and saying an affirmation. And the Greek Witch of Pensacola had very kindly marked up this book with stars with the spells that worked. And we have these now in our collection. But that does raise an interesting question. Do books absorb an aura of their owners? We know we collect autograph books because a person that someone we liked, an author or something, had personally autographed the book, held it in their hands, and somehow we feel holding the same item in our hand imparts a kind of a presence of that person to it. But what about books and materials owned by evil people and evil men? We actually had a team of ghost hunters go through our archives with their electronic recorders and cameras and infrared lights, and well, they didn't find anything. They did say there was one spot where every time they walked through it, their equipment would automatically shut off, and they refused to tell me where that spot was, so I can't help you today. But it is a fact that the library is so well insulated, and there are so many thicknesses of the walls. It's quite possible that they had something there. There are many haunted places in Pensacola because of the area's long history, and yes, bloody history, with the fighting of Spanish and British armies, battles with the Indian, pirates, and many ghost stories and reported haunting coincide with structures and buildings that are still here. In 1865, we have the account of an army lieutenant named Henry Sanford Ganvort, and he was stationed at Fort Barrancas, and he served various administrative positions until he was transferred to Boston in 1869. He wrote frequently to his sister, and excerpts of his letters were published in 1875. We have this book in our collection. In July and August of 1867, Pensacola and the fort were struck with yellow fever. Fort Barranca became an army hospital with men who were not sick and the men who were not sick were moved to Fort Picken. Although the causes of yellow fever were not known at the time, it was believed to come from swamp gas. With the stronger breezes and salt air of Picken seemed more safe. And on August 1867, Ganbert wrote his wife that he was at Picken, but that the quarantine doctor kept coming back to the fort after treating patients, which worried him, and even bringing some patients to the fort, who he then would send about a mile from the fort. At least 30 soldiers died of yellow fever at Fort Barranca. On August 29, 1867, he wrote that Captain Hale of the Marines and his lieutenant had died. By November, he was writing that the yellow fever had disappeared from the Navy Yard in Pensacola, but in a letter of November 26, 1867, he said that the ghost of Captain Hale of the Marines, who he reported had died, was seen by the sentinels when on their midnight round on the outer wall. They charged with bayonets, and it disappeared. And even today, there are tales and reports of ghostly hauntings in various buildings of the Naval Air Station, as well as Fort Pickens and Barrancas. In the fort, the tunnels or concourses are dark, long, sometimes dank, and sometimes strange shadows lurk in the corners where unusual sounds can be heard. There have also been reports of hearing the sounds of cannon and gunfire and other such noises. The next story I want to share with you called Where's My Medicine? In the Navy Yard, Johnson Street was often called Admiral's Row due to the large 1870 era homes that were built there for the Admiral. Quarter A in 1874 was the home of Commodore Melanchthon B. Woolsey, and there was again an outbreak of yellow fever. Now, Woolsey didn't want to become a victim. So he moved to the third floor cupola of this house, and he had his daily supply of food and medicinal rum delivered to him by a wicker basket that he lowered to the ground by a rope and brought up. But it said one day his medicine was not in the basket, so he came downstairs, and shortly thereafter he contracted yellow fever and he died in the residence. It is said that his spirit occasionally walks the third floor cupola, and there are strong odors of pipe tobacco. Another story that's come our way is called The Dreadful Stain. And another haunted, it comes with the haunted site of the Pensacola Lighthouse, especially the keeper's quarters. Now I know a little bit more about this firsthand because for many years we had a library employee named Diane Levi. And Diane Levi took one of our history courses here at the university. And what she did was she went out and interviewed people who had had ghost experiences or ghostly things happen to them in Pensacola. And she knew a lot about the lighthouse. It is believed the lighthouse is haunted by Jeremiah Ingraham. Although he died in 1840 and the present lighthouse was built in 1858 on the same site, it is believed he haunts it. Twice a day, Jeremiah would climb the 166th step to the top, carrying a bucket of whale oil for the light. He was believed to have been killed by his wife, Michaela, in 1840 on a foul night. The darkness rent with screaming and yelling and arguing, and one account saying she burst through the front door covered in blood dripping from the butcher knife. And she was taken to jail, but claimed self-defense and was released. She took over as the lighthouse keeper, a female lighthouse keeper, for the next 15 years. Families that lived in the keeper quarters have reported open and locked doors, a stain by the fireplace that is scrubbed and scrubbed and scrubbed and still comes back the next day and is believed to be Jeremiah's blood. Diane Levi herself had told me one day she was working late and she heard someone walking up the stairs from the basement, and when she checked, she was closing, and she said, and she heard Dip coming up, and she opened the door, and there was no one there. One of the tour guide one day was talking about a ghost, and one of the doors, which was locked, instantly flew open. One of the ghost hauntings that I'm more connected to, because I've heard this story directly from the lips of several people that happened to, I call it Don't Look Under the Church. Old Christ Church in Seville Square was built in 1832-1834 period. Ministers of the church are called rectors, and in the 19th century they were often buried under the floor of the church. We've known that three rectors of Christ Church, Joseph H. Saunders, died of yellow fever in 1839, Frederick Peake, died of consumption in 1846. Consumption is another term for tuberculosis. And David Flower, who died of yellow fever in 1853, were all buried under the floor of the church. The last service in the church was 1903 when the congregation moved to their new building on Palafox Street. We have an account of George Hallmark, who always alleged that during the Civil War, Union troops dug through the floorboard and violated the body, looking for gold ornaments and other things that might have been buried with the rector. Dr. Beverly Madison Kern, rector of Christ Church in the 1980s, was able to secure private funding, and in 1988, the UWF Archaeology Department began the search for the rector. It was a combined project utilizing the archaeology department staff, headed by Judy Benz, and students in the program as well as volunteers. Now, one of the students was a young man named Gary Powell, and he was a paraplegic. And they made him the recorder, keeping notes of the details of the dig and the archaeological record. Since the building was being used by the Pensacola Historical Society as a museum, they dug in from the back of the church, and they were able to locate the three rectors, remove their bones and remains of coffins and material. They were able to identify the individual because they had descriptions of their height and they knew what they looked like. And yes, it did appear that at least two of the graves had been violated. During the project, the bones of the rectors were stored at the nearby Lear Rochblave house, and on at least one occasion when students came back the next day after locking up for the night, their carefully laid out skeleton had been moved around. After locating and identifying the remains, a consecration and a funeral service for reburial was held on July 23, 1988. New coffins of red cedar were made, and Reverend Kern used the 1789 Book of Common Prayer of the Episcopal Church, exactly what would have been used for the original burial of the rector. Gary Powell continued documenting the event for the archaeology and historical record. The day after the funeral, he called Reverend Kern, and he said he'd been able to identify everyone in the funeral procession, except for the three ministers who'd been walking by Reverend Kern as the coffin were returned to the church. Gary described each of the three individuals. He noted their clothes, the colors of their stoles, the kind of crosses they were wearing, and everything. The only thing he noted strange about them was they all seemed to be barefoot. Reverend Kern replied, well, there was no one walking behind me. So we believe that the three rectors returned to celebrate their own funeral. And that's a ghost story that has been shared here at the university among some of the faculty. And I heard this story from Reverend Kern, but also Dick Smith, who was chair of our physics department and on the vestry of Christ Church. And speaking of rectors, the temporary storage was the Lear Rochblave house, which is here part of the historic village today. It was built in 1887 by Kate and John Lear and sold in 1897 to Benito Rochblave and his wife, Catherine Elizabeth, who lived there until 1912. The style of the house is called folk Victorian. After being acquired by the UWF Historic Trust, the house underwent renovation, and a worker on a ladder saw a woman in a Victorian dress dancing in a room. He quickly climbed down the ladder, but when he returned, no one was there. Often a strong smell or perfume can be noticed in the room. And as I mentioned, the bones in the coffin for the rector have been stored in this building, and they were disturbed. Another house in Seville Square district is the Dorr House. Clara Barclay Dorr married Eben Walker Dorr in 1849. He was the first sheriff of Escambia County and a partner in the Simpson and Company sawmill in Baghdad, Florida. He died in 1870 and left his widow $51,000, which is a literal fortune in 1870, and she used it to buy this piece of property and build this classical Greek revival style house. She and her 5 children lived here until 1896. It was purchased and restored by the Pensacola Heritage Foundation in 1964 and is now part of the Historic Trust property today. Guides and visitors have reported the ghost of a lady who glides through the rooms, have been seen on the balcony, and often the strong odor of roses can be noted in the building. As I mentioned, there's a lot of stories of Pensacola, and that's because this is a town that has seen a lot over the years. And this early picture of Pensacola in the 1770s shows the fort, and the streets on either side of the fort are Alkanese and Palafox streets. And so this is the extent of the old Pensacola and along the waterfront. Now, one of the stories, there's a lot of stories of ghosts, and a lot of them have errors, a lot of them get changed over time. And the one that I've heard about in some cases is the ghost of Romana Street. It's a headless woman named Susan Walton. The story is that in the 1820s, a man and his daughter were walking the street and interrupted a group of pirates who were killing and robbing people. Mr. Walton was killed, and they attempted to drag Sarah off, but she fought hard, and after gouging out the eye of the pirate that was dragging her, he lopped off her head. And the story goes she can still be seen on the street looking for her head. Another story I like to tell about Pensacola is the Hanged Man. The what's called the Pensacola. I'll get back to my notes here. Let me go on a little bit. The Pensacola Little Theater is housed in this building today, but it actually used to be a courthouse and a jail. And this is an old picture of the jail. And for many years, it stood vacant because it was cleared out and replaced. And the eventually it was restored, and the whole building closed in and turned into office and so forth. But the Pensacola Little Theater talks about the ghost of Hosea Poole. And Hosea Poole was the last man hung in the building, and they claim he haunted the theater. Now, the original story of Hosea Poole is that his brother Albert accused him of stealing some of his clothes, and Hosea was imprisoned and given a short jail sentence, but also made a jail trustee. One evening, he was given permission to leave the jail for a few minutes, and he walked to the Muskogee Wharf with his brother Albert, and there killed his brother with an axe. And because of that, he was sentenced to hang on July 30th, 1920. On his last day, July 29th, there were countless visitors to his jail to see the condemned man. And the people didn't come to, they were allowed to walk down the hallway past his cell. I mean, it was just the whole community wanted to see this man that was going to be hanged. The interesting thing is that the jailer took collection from visitors to buy suitable clothes and burials for him. Visitors were after anywhere from a nickel to $1, and some of them thought they were being charged admission to see the condemned man. And he was hung on July 30th. Now, I have the original newspaper accounts, but if you go back to the little theater in 2003, they say that he was secretly in love with their brother's fiancee, a woman who went insane with grief and died on the steps of the courthouse on the day of Hosea's execution. I have never found any evidence of this. I have not been able to find anything about it, but it's the kind of ghost story that sounds really good. Um, and I have a picture of the uh, the state of Florida changed its law in 1924, and that made him the last person hung in the county. One of my favorite stories is called "Mary, Are You There?" There was a man named Robert E. McIntyre in the 1920s, and he founded a company and they produced a patent medicine called anti-thiamine healing gas. A wonderful antidote for burns and blisters and insect bites and neuralgia and rheumatism, and they had their headquarters on Wright Street, and they ran ads all throughout the South and different papers and all that. And this so-called drink they call a healing gas would, if you look at the ad, practically cure every disease you could ever think of. But what you don't know is the formula for this gas they got by holding seances. They believed their company was being directed by voices from the other world. And they would have these seances and they would ask the medium a question. And supposedly the spirit from the other world would come into the medium and she would write their answers on a piece of paper. And these are examples of the records of this company that we actually have here in the archive with the medium spirit handwriting written a person named Mary that would write in the answers to their question when they had their board meeting by seance. And so there are several handwritings on here, one being the question and one being the answer. And you'll notice the first line up there, it says, Mary is here. Another wonderful ghost story that I like to talk about is where Gustaf. In the 1840s, a man named Reverend John Newton came into Walton County, and he was a Presbyterian minister, and he started a school at the town of Uchiana, Florida. And during the Civil War, he did not agree with the Civil War. He actually wrote some letters talking about what he called the hotheads of Walton County. And he took his family to California to set out the Civil War and came back to Walton County after the Civil War. But he was considered a traitor to the South, and so he left his family in the care of his brother-in-law, and he continued to work for the Presbyterian Church. He traveled through Iowa and Missouri and other places, helping set up Presbyterian churches. In about 1869, maybe 1870, he came back to Walton County, picked up his family, and settled down near on the Santa Rosa Sound. And the area he brought with him his wife and his two daughters, Mary and Esther. In the area he settled, he became postmaster, and it was named Mary Esther, Florida. In 1889, his daughter Esther came to see him and said that she had met the love of her life. His name was Gustaf Axelson. He had a ship and he sailed between New Orleans, Pensacola, Key West, Philadelphia. He took crops back and forth, and she married him. Reverend Newton married them, and they moved to Pensacola, and they bought this house from the Berger family, another Swedish family, and it today is called the Axelson Berger House. There's actually two houses here. In 1903, Gustaf was washed overseas. His ship floundered in a storm, and he was washed off the deck and never seen again. And it's said on night when the clouds cover the moon in Pensacola, and there's a high keening wind coming off of the bay. It seems, and the shadows lengthen in the night. There's a light that moves from window to window of the Axelson house, and it's old widow Axelson waiting for Gustaf to come home from the sea. Well, where do our ghostly tales come from? They come from the newspaper stories. They come from word of mouth. They come from written oral history reminiscences, letter, diary, correspondence, books, sometimes from the websites of ghost hunters. And I've seen some really incredible things they picked up here. And these are some of the books that have been published. We have them here. Some of the books that have been published where people take the stories and that they've heard and they expand on them and publish them. Now, some final words. I will say in 1937, as part of the Federal Writers Project in Pensacola, there were interviews done of African Americans who had been enslaved people in the community before the Civil War, or were they oldest people? And we actually have the words of a man named Tom Moreno, aged 96, in 1937, who shared what he knew about ghosts in Pensacola. He said there was haunted houses all around Pensacola. You never know when you were going to get in one. I'm going to tell you the truth. I remember the house that I used to live in. Me and my wife lived in one half, and a woman had the other half. It was on the short street, Bruce Street. That woman on the other side was tormented, but she just moved out and wouldn't tell us there were ghosts. One night I was lying in the bed, and something came a walking and walking and just worried me to death. Something tall and thin and white came in the room and stood over me and my wife. The dishes would rattle, and me and my wife both went out of the window. That must have been the house where the sailor was murdered, and there was blood all over this house. I had a dog that Gambell gave me. One night he hollered an awful holler, and I haven't seen that dog till this day. There was a house by Escambia Bridge. Every night when the moon was bright as day, there would be a crunching on the oyster shell, and the tallest man I ever seen or heard would walk about. They wanted me to follow him, but I wouldn't do it. One time a woman followed him and went to a certain spot where she dug up a jar of gold. Anybody born with a caul over the eye can see spirits. When you die, your body is in the cemetery. Your soul and spirit are not. They are in the wind everywhere. There once was a young man who, when he was a good lad of a boy about 18 or 19 years old, killed another fellow with a Barlow knife. In those days, the courts would keep you after you for years and years, especially if you'd killed a person. One day, years later, this man wrote a note at his office on Palafox Street and killed himself. In the note, he said that the man he killed had come for him and said to him, "Get yourself ready. It's time for you to go with me." And with that, it's also time for me to go. I hope I've enlightened you a little bit on some of the ghost stories of West Florida and some of the things that haunt us even today. Thank you.
Thanks, Dean.
Thank you.
Uh huh. Goodbye, and hope all of you have a happy Halloween.
Thank you.